I sat there silent, my linen napkin still folded in my lap as the laughter died in the dining room. The red wine soaked through my velvet dress like a bruise spreading in slow motion. "Guess I missed," my grandson said, the smirk barely hidden behind his apology. No one corrected him. No one defended me. After 30 years of hosting this dinner, after burying a husband and raising a broken son, I had become the punchline in my own home. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Snow powdered the stained glass windows of Eleanor Bishop's Victorian home, each flake catching the soft gold light from inside. The dining room was a Norman Rockwell painting come to life, candles flickering, cranberry glaze gleaming on the ham. The Bishop family gathered for what should have been a perfect Christmas dinner. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her velvet dress a deep burgundy that matched the roses she'd arranged herself that morning. She'd spent hours polishing the silver Greg had once insisted she keep. Because family deserves to eat like it matters. His absence hovered over the table like a shadow too polite to name. Connor was late, as usual. He arrived with his mother's cologne on his coat, his grin practiced. "Sorry, Grandma. Traffic," he said, though no one believed him. He took the seat opposite Eleanor, the one Greg used to claim. Dinner began with small talk. Weather, travel, the usual scaffolding of politeness that kept real conversation from breaking through. Monica, ever poised, commented on Eleanor's tableware. "Vintage is charming," she said, her smile too thin. Eleanor only nodded. She'd been collecting charm all her life. She didn't need it explained. When the wine was passed, Connor reached for the bottle with theatrical ease. "Allow me," he said. His tone carried that boyish arrogance he'd never grown out of, the kind that thought wit could pass for warmth. He filled his own glass first, then Monica's, and finally turned toward Eleanor. "Red or white, Grandma?" "Red, please." He tilted the bottle with exaggerated flourish, and the moment stretched, a small tilt too far. The splash too direct. The wine poured not into her glass, but over her lap, soaking into the velvet like spreading blood. Gasps circled the table. Monica reached for napkins. Trudy froze mid-sip, and the candles wavered in the draft of sudden silence. "Oh no," Connor said flatly, his mouth twitching at the corners. "Guess I missed." Eleanor looked down at the dark stain blooming across the fabric, her reflection trembling in the red surface of the table wine. She didn't move for several seconds. The room waited for her to scold, to snap, to react. She did none of those things. She folded her napkin once, set it beside her plate, and rose. "Excuse me," she said quietly. Her voice carried the same tone she used when shelving books decades ago. Composed, deliberate, final. In the hallway mirror, her expression didn't falter. She saw her son's eyes in her own reflection, calm, patient, unflinching. She made her way to the downstairs bathroom, closing the door softly behind her. Inside, the light was colder. The mirror fogged faintly from the radiator. She dampened a towel and dabbed at the velvet, watching the water bloom darker before fading again. The smell of red wine mixed with faint lavender soap. Oddly comforting, like a memory she didn't know she'd missed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Trudy, sent from the kitchen. That wasn't an accident. Eleanor stared at the screen, her lips pressing into a thin, measured line. She typed back, slowly, deliberately. "Neither is what I'm about to do." She placed the phone face down on the sink counter, its faint vibration echoing once more as another message came through. She didn't check it. Instead, she folded the damp towel neatly, smoothing its corners as if organizing her next thought. In the mirror, the stain looked darker than before, almost regal against the velvet. Outside the bathroom, she could hear laughter. Forced, polite, the sound of people pretending nothing had happened. Connor's voice rose above the others, spinning some half-joke to fill the silence she'd left behind. Eleanor took one last look at herself, then turned off the light. When she stepped back into the hallway, the conversation at the table dipped, eyes turning toward her. She offered a small, practiced smile. "Please," she said, "don't stop on my account." She moved past them, calm as snowfall, and refilled her own empty glass with what little wine remained in the bottle. Her hand didn't shake. Connor watched her closely, his smirk wavering as she raised the glass, holding his gaze over the rim. "To family," she said evenly, "however we define it." She took a slow sip. The clock on the mantel chimed once, low and deliberate, as though marking the start of something that could not be undone. And somewhere deep inside her, under years of restraint and good manners, something long dormant stirred awake. The dishes were cleared, though the tension lingered like smoke. The scent of cinnamon candles mixed with roasted ham and wax, a sweetness turned heavy in the quiet that followed dessert. Eleanor stood at the buffet table, her movements graceful, deliberate, as she arranged a small pyramid of wrapped gifts. The wrapping paper shimmered gold and ivory, understated, elegant, exactly her taste. "Gift time," Trudy announced, ever the cheerful bridge between civility and chaos. Her diner warmth didn't quite melt the frost in the air. Connor slouched back in his chair, phone in hand, the glow from the screen catching the smug curve of his jaw. "Finally," he muttered. Eleanor smiled faintly. She handed the first parcel to Monica, a silk scarf in deep winter green. "You always looked best in jewel tones," Eleanor said. Monica blinked, surprised by the sincerity, then offered a careful, "Thank you." Trudy received a hand-knit shawl, soft as breath, and clutched it to her chest. "You've still got it, Elle," she said, "and better taste than Macy's." Eleanor chuckled softly. "I try." Even the younger cousins received something thoughtful, an old coin collection for one, a first edition poetry book for another. The laughter that followed grew lighter, the house thawing just a little with each gift exchanged, until there was only one unopened box left on the table, small, square, wrapped in silver paper. Connor's eyes flicked to it, then back to Eleanor. "Guess that one's mine," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Eleanor tilted her head, a faint crease at the corner of her mouth. "Is it?" He frowned. "Well, it's the only one left." Eleanor clasped her hands gently in front of her. "I think that one's for the neighbor's son. He shovels my walk." Connor's smile froze, his jaw tightening. "You're kidding." "I rarely do," she replied, tone even, eyes calm. The silence rippled across the table again, that same suffocating pause from earlier in the evening. Monica, always the social firefighter, forced a laugh. "Oh, come on, Eleanor. Maybe his gift's in the stocking? Or still upstairs?" Eleanor met her gaze with cool steadiness. "No. I know exactly what I gave." The words landed softly but with the finality of a gavel. Connor set down his phone with a click. "Wow," he said. "So this is what, payback for the wine thing? You think I did that on purpose?" Eleanor smiled just enough to be polite. "Think? No. I know when something's intentional." Trudy, seated at the far end of the table, took a long sip of coffee, hiding a grin behind the rim. "Well," she said, "maybe next year you'll earn your spot on the nice list." Connor's glare darted toward her, but Eleanor's stillness drew his attention back. She'd become a mirror he couldn't read. And it unnerved him more than if she'd shouted. He leaned forward. "You really don't want to start something you can't finish. Grandma." The phrase hung in the air like a dare. Eleanor tilted her head almost sympathetically. Oh, Connor, I never start anything without knowing exactly how it ends. Trudy set her mug down, eyes wide with quiet delight. Monica looked ready to bolt, her nails tapping against her water glass in a nervous rhythm. Eleanor rose from her seat, gathering the remaining ribbons into a neat bundle. I think that's quite enough celebration for one evening. Monica's voice softened. Eleanor, please. He's just... But Eleanor was already turning toward the staircase, her movements steady, composed. Good night, everyone, she said. It's been illuminating. Connor muttered something under his breath, a curse, low and bitter. But Eleanor didn't look back. She climbed the stairs with the poise of a queen retiring from a court she no longer recognized. At the top landing, she paused. Through the banister, she could see the living room below. Connor now pacing, Monica hissing at him to stop, Trudy trying to change the subject. The Christmas tree's lights blinked lazily, casting fractured reflections across the wine stain still marking Eleanor's chair. She pressed her palm against the smooth railing, the wood cool beneath her skin, and exhaled slowly. Her pulse had steadied, not from indifference, but from clarity. In her bedroom, she opened the top drawer of her writing desk. Inside lay an envelope, already sealed, marked with Martin Dahl's name, her attorney. She slid it slightly forward, enough to catch the lamplight, and whispered, "Almost time." Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the world in white. Downstairs, Connor's voice rose again, sharp with disbelief. Eleanor smiled to herself, the calm before the storm she had already chosen to unleash. The next morning, St. Paul wore its winter silence like a shroud. The storm had passed, leaving the streets buried in white, the world scrubbed clean. Almost. Eleanor Bishop pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she crossed the sidewalk toward Martin Dahl's downtown office. Her boots crunched over frozen snow, her gloved hand gripping the briefcase that held everything she needed to end a chapter of her family's history. The faint red stain still marked the sleeve of her coat, a shadow of last night's humiliation she hadn't bothered to remove. Martin's office overlooked Rice Park, where the ice rink glimmered in the pale sun. Inside, warmth wrapped her like an old blanket. Cedar-paneled walls, the smell of paper and coffee, the quiet shuffle of a secretary who greeted her with genuine respect. "Good morning, Mrs. Bishop. He's expecting you." Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm right on time." Martin looked up from his desk as she entered. His suit was the same slate gray he always wore, his expression marked by calm precision. He stood, smiling faintly. "Eleanor," he said, "you look like a woman with purpose." "I am." She set her briefcase down on the leather chair opposite him. "Let's make this official." He motioned toward the stack of papers waiting in a neat pile on his desk. "I've drawn up everything we discussed. All you need to do is sign." Eleanor removed her gloves, slowly, methodically, like peeling away a disguise. She sat, adjusted her glasses, and opened the folder. The pages smelled faintly of ink and formality. Her late husband's name appeared first, then her son Greg's. The handwriting from years ago captured forever in a signature he'd never know she'd revise. She paused when she saw Connor's name, her grandson's inheritance written out like an assumption of loyalty. It took her a moment to steady her pen. "Take your time," Martin said gently. She looked up at him. "I'm not hesitating." Her pen moved across the page in slow, elegant strokes. "Eleanor M. Bishop." Martin watched, saying nothing until she placed the pen back in its holder with care. "That's it then," he said. "You've just rewritten your legacy." Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "No," she corrected softly. "I've clarified it." He nodded once, understanding the tone beneath the words. "The foundation you chose, it's a good one. Local, transparent, well run. They'll be thrilled." I didn't do it for their gratitude, she said. I did it for the women who will never have someone like Greg to believe in them. Her gaze flicked to the window. Outside, a young woman in scrubs hurried across the icy street, her shoulders hunched against the cold. Eleanor watched her disappear around the corner and smiled faintly. Martin leaned back, folding his hands. You know, Connor might try to contest this. Families often do, even when they know they don't have ground. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes clear and unflinching. He'll try, because entitlement is the only language he knows, but I've made sure every T is crossed, every signature witnessed. He'll have no case. Martin's mouth quirked into a smile. That's what I thought you'd say. She rose, smoothing her coat. You know, Martin, she said, glancing down at the faint wine mark near her cuff. It's funny how quickly arrogance can turn into fear. Connor always struck me as intense, he said carefully. Eleanor's tone sharpened slightly. Intensity isn't a virtue when it's empty. He nodded. So this is it? The final version? For now, she said. But tell your notary to keep their pen ready. I'm far from finished. Martin chuckled softly. You always were the most disciplined librarian I ever met. She gave him a small, knowing smile. Shelving books and rearranging legacies aren't so different. You just have to know what deserves to stay. He tapped the signed documents into alignment, slid them into a folder, and handed her a copy. Congratulations, Eleanor. You've done everything right. She accepted it with both hands. He lost more than his place in the will that night, Martin. His brow lifted. What else did he lose? Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the faint stain again. My silence. For a long moment the office was quiet except for the faint hum of the radiator and the distant sound of church bells echoing across the river. Eleanor slipped her gloves back on and turned toward the door. Send me confirmation once it's filed. I'll handle it personally, he said. She paused in the doorway, the winter light cutting across her face. Good. Because some lessons, she said softly, should be permanent. As she stepped back into the cold, snowflakes drifted down, catching in her gray hair. She didn't brush them away. The city around her gleamed white and endless, every path a blank page waiting for what she would write next. The diner's bell gave a hollow jingle as Eleanor stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat. The morning light cut in sharp through the windows, bouncing off chrome fixtures and the faded red booths. Trudy's diner smelled of coffee, cinnamon rolls, and frying bacon. A smell Eleanor usually associated with comfort. Today, though, there was something else in the air. A meeting she hadn't asked for. Monica Bishop was already there, sitting in a corner booth, posture perfect, a scarf knotted like armor around her neck. Her phone lay face down on the table, as if to suggest undivided attention. Eleanor, she said brightly, thank you for coming. Eleanor slid into the seat across from her, setting her gloves on the table. You said it was important. It is. Monica waved to the waitress, ordering 2 teas before Eleanor could. I thought we should talk. Family to family. Eleanor's lips curved faintly. How novel. The waitress poured steaming water into thick mugs and moved off, leaving a small bowl of sugar packets between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Monica was the first to break the silence. I know things have been tense, she began, voice smooth, rehearsed. Connor feels awful about Christmas night. Eleanor stirred her tea, the spoon tapping once, twice, before she set it aside. Does he? Monica's smile tightened. He's young, impulsive, but he's trying to turn things around. He's thinking of starting a business. Something in property, maybe consulting. He just needs a little seed capital to get started. Eleanor looked up, meeting her daughter-in-law's gaze with calm precision. Seed capital. She repeated the phrase as if testing it for flavor. That's an interesting choice of words. Monica shifted slightly in her seat. I know you're cautious, but you have the means to help him, and it would be good for the family, for your legacy. My legacy, Eleanor said softly, is already decided. Monica blinked. What do you mean? I mean, I've arranged things in a way that won't require last-minute rescues. Monica's tone sharpened, though the smile never vanished. You don't want to die with enemies, do you? Eleanor's eyes didn't waver. No, she said, her voice soft but deliberate. That's why I'm cleaning house. The words hung between them, quiet but unmovable, a truth wrapped in velvet. Monica reached for her cup, but her hand trembled slightly. You've always had a way with words, she said, forcing a light laugh. You make even threats sound elegant. I wasn't threatening you, dear, Eleanor said, leaning back. Threats require the possibility of negotiation. Monica's expression faltered for a heartbeat, then recovered. Connor's your only grandson. Greg would want you to help him. Eleanor looked toward the frosted window, where a plow pushed snow down Summit Avenue in rhythmic bursts. Greg wanted him to learn accountability. I'm just making sure he gets that lesson, even if I have to deliver it myself. For the first time, Monica's mask cracked. You've changed, she whispered. Eleanor smiled. No, I've remembered who I am. A long silence followed. The diner's hum filled the space between them. The hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of strangers, the faint Christmas music playing from a speaker above the counter. When Eleanor finally stood, Monica looked up, her lips parting as if to speak, but Eleanor simply reached for her gloves, slipping them on one finger at a time. Take care driving home, she said. The roads get slick near the river. Monica frowned. That's it? You're just walking away? Eleanor placed a $5 bill beside her untouched tea. I already walked away, Monica. You're just noticing now. She left the diner without looking back. Outside, the air bit at her cheeks. The snow had begun again, soft, fine flakes that landed on her coat and melted instantly. The sky was white, endless, and bright enough to sting her eyes. She breathed it in and felt the quiet satisfaction of momentum, the kind that came after years of being still. Back home, her Victorian house glowed in the afternoon light. She moved through its rooms with practiced ease, the ticking clock in the parlor, the faint scent of pine from the wreath on the door, the comfort of order restored. At her writing desk, she opened a drawer and pulled out the copy of the amended will Martin had given her. She wrapped it carefully in gold paper, the same she'd used for Christmas gifts, and tied it with a dark green ribbon. The paper crinkled softly under her hands. She wrote a single name on the tag, Connor. Setting the package aside, she exhaled slowly, her pulse steady. The clock in the hallway chimed once, low and deliberate, like it had that Christmas night. Her reflection in the window smiled faintly back. Let's see, she murmured, if he recognizes a real gift when he opens it. Christmas night had stretched longer than anyone wanted it to. The fire in the parlor had sunk to embers, leaving the room in a haze of orange light and quiet exhaustion. Wrapping paper littered the floor like discarded masks. Laughter had worn thin hours ago. Still, the ritual continued, the last of the gifts waiting to be opened. Eleanor sat by the window, her back straight, a cup of cooling tea balanced precisely on the arm of her chair. The snow outside had turned heavy, blanketing the streets and muting the world beyond. Inside, only the sound of rustling paper and Monica's brittle laughter filled the space. Connor sprawled on the couch, looking every inch the man who believed the evening had gone his way. His charm had returned. The practiced grin, the effortless chatter, the smug ease of someone who mistook temporary tolerance for forgiveness. Then his gaze caught the last package on the table. Gold paper, green ribbon. his name in Eleanor's careful script. "Well," he said, his grin widening, "I was starting to think you forgot me this year." Eleanor looked up from her tea. "I didn't forget." Trudy, perched near the fireplace, hid a knowing smirk behind her mug of cocoa. Monica, ever the diplomat, added quickly, "See, I told you she had something for you." Eleanor gestured toward the gift with an open hand. "Go ahead, Connor. That one's just for you." Connor leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. The paper tore in careful, deliberate pulls. Less eagerness, more suspicion. When the box finally opened, his smirk faltered. Inside was an envelope. Heavy, official, stamped with Martin Dahl's firm's seal. His brow furrowed. "What's this?" Eleanor's tone was serene. "Something you've earned." He slid the papers out and began reading. The shift in his expression was slow. Amusement curdling into confusion, confusion into disbelief, disbelief into fury. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, flipping through the pages. His voice rose, sharp and unsteady. This isn't real." Monica leaned forward, alarmed. "Connor, what is it?" He turned the documents toward her, his hand shaking. "She changed it. She changed the damn will." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the dying fire. Monica snatched the papers from him and scanned the text, her face draining of color. "You!" she started, looking at Eleanor with something between disbelief and horror. "You gave it all away?" Eleanor took a slow sip of tea before answering. "Not all. Just what no longer deserved to be hoarded." Monica's breath hitched. "You left everything to some charity? A literacy fund?" Eleanor nodded. "The St. Paul Women's Literacy Foundation. They do real work, Monica. The kind that changes lives." Connor slammed his fist on the coffee table, rattling the china. "You're insane. Dad wanted that money to stay in the family." Eleanor's eyes lifted to his, unshaken. "Your father wanted integrity to stay in the family. The rest was optional." He stood abruptly, pacing. "You can't just erase me like this. You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone and get away with it?" Trudy set her mug down gently. "Careful, kid," she said. "You're already doing that part yourself." Connor ignored her. His voice cracked as he turned back to Eleanor. "You'll regret this." Eleanor's tone softened, almost pitying. "No, dear. Regret comes from doubt. And I have none." Monica's composure finally broke. The mask she wore so tightly slipped. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice trembling. "You're cutting off your blood." Eleanor rose, her every movement deliberate. "Blood doesn't make family," she said. "Character does. And yours has been running thin." For a moment, no one moved. The tension pressed down like the weight of the snow outside, heavy and inevitable. Connor's jaw flexed. He opened his mouth as if to speak again, but no words came, only a sharp exhale through clenched teeth. He grabbed his coat from the back of the couch and stormed toward the door. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the glass ornament still hanging from the tree. Eleanor stood perfectly still. The clock ticked on, steady, unbothered. Monica remained frozen on the couch, the papers limp in her hands. Finally, she looked up, her voice hoarse. "You'll regret this," she repeated. Eleanor turned toward the fireplace where the last embers pulsed faintly in the dark. "No," she said softly. "You will." The words landed like a closing curtain. Outside, through the window, Connor's car engine roared to life, then faded into the snowy distance. Eleanor picked up her teacup again, now stone cold, and stared into its surface, the faint reflection of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for approval. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock chimed midnight. The sound of the slammed door still echoed through Eleanor's house long after the car's headlights disappeared into the dark. The snow outside had swallowed the driveway again, and the silence that followed was total. The kind that felt less like peace and more like aftermath. Eleanor stood for a moment by the window, the hem of her skirt brushing the old radiator. The glass had fogged slightly from her breath. Somewhere behind her, Monica shuffled papers and muttered to herself, but Eleanor didn't turn around. She simply reached forward and drew the heavy curtains closed. When she finally faced the room again, Monica was gathering her coat, her face pale and tight. "You've gone too far this time," she said, voice brittle. Eleanor's tone was mild. "If you say so." "You'll regret this," Monica spat, echoing her son's last words. Eleanor smiled faintly, weary but composed. "Regret comes from doubt. I have none." That ended it. Monica hesitated, as if searching for something cutting to say, then simply turned and left, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the wood floors. The front door closed behind her, gentler this time, but it felt just as final. Eleanor exhaled slowly and looked toward the mantel. A photograph of Greg, taken the summer before he died, caught the glow of the dying fire. He'd been laughing in it, his arm around a much younger Connor, both faces bright with something like hope. The sight stung, but it didn't undo her. It only reminded her why she'd acted at all. The next morning, pale sunlight spilled across the snow-laden street. The air carried that clean, sharp cold that made every sound distinct, the scrape of shovels, the hum of distant plows. Inside, the house was still except for the faint hum of the furnace. A knock came at the back door. Eleanor didn't have to check who it was. Trudy Lawson stood there, cheeks pink from the cold, a foil-covered pie in her mittened hands. "Apple crumble," she said, pushing past the threshold like she owned the place. "Don't tell me you haven't eaten since last night." Eleanor smiled, genuinely this time. "You always did have the timing of an angel with attitude." "Don't butter me up, Elle," Trudy said, setting the pie down and peeling off her gloves. "How bad was it?" Eleanor poured coffee while she answered. "He opened it. He raged." "He left." Trudy snorted. "Predictable as January." Eleanor handed her a mug. "Monica stayed behind long enough to call me vindictive." Trudy laughed into her cup. "If protecting yourself makes you vindictive, I say we could use more of it." Eleanor's smile lingered but didn't reach her eyes. "They'll try to challenge it. You know that." Trudy leaned forward, lowering her voice. "And you've got it all locked down, right?" Eleanor nodded. "Martin saw to every line, and I had a competency exam recorded last week. On video, notarized, time-stamped. If they come for it, they'll trip on their own arrogance before they reach the courthouse steps." Trudy's grin was sharp and proud. "I swear if I didn't know you better, I'd say you were enjoying this." Eleanor's tone softened. "I'm not. But I am. Resolved." They ate in quiet companionship, the warmth of coffee and cinnamon filling the kitchen. Outside, the snow began again, soft and endless, frosting the window glass in lace. Around noon, the phone rang, sharp and insistent. Trudy gave Eleanor a look that said, "I'll stay quiet," and sipped her coffee. Eleanor answered, "Good morning." Monica's voice came through like a blade. "You think this is over? Connor's already spoken to an attorney. We'll see what a judge thinks about your little stunt." Eleanor's reply was calm. "You should tell your attorney to contact Martin Dahl. He has all the documentation. And the recording." A pause. Then, "Recording?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "The one proving I'm perfectly sound of mind. It's quite thorough. The doctor even complimented my recall of the Gettysburg Address." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Eleanor to hear her own clock ticking. Finally, Monica hissed, "You're cruel." "No," Eleanor said gently. "I'm clear." She hung up before Monica could respond. Trudy was grinning openly now. Lord L., you should have been a lawyer. Eleanor returned to her coffee, her expression unreadable. No, she said after a moment. Lawyers argue to win. I just wanted peace. The phone stayed silent for the rest of the day. Later that evening, she sat by the fire again, the pie half-eaten, the house quiet. A message pinged on her phone. From Martin. Filed. All verified. They'll lose. If they even try. Eleanor typed only one word in reply. Good. She placed the phone down beside her tea, leaned back in her chair, and closed her eyes. Outside, wind lifted the snow into small flurries that swirled past the window, glittering like tiny fragments of glass. Eleanor opened her eyes just long enough to watch them fall. Let them try, she whispered. The conference room smelled faintly of cedar polish and old arguments. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline muffled in gray snow, and the ticking of Martin Dahl's antique wall clock filled the pauses no one wanted to break. Eleanor sat at the end of the long mahogany table, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. The gold brooch at her collar caught the weak winter light. Subtle armor for the war she'd already won. Across from her, Connor slouched with the defiance of a man who believed anger could substitute for reason. Monica sat beside him, every hair in place, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. Between them, a silence buzzed like static. Martin closed the folder before him, glanced from one party to the other, and said, "Let's begin." Connor was first to speak, or rather, to explode. "This is financial abuse," he snapped. "You took advantage of grief, of trust, of me." Eleanor folded her hands on the table, calm as ice. "No, Connor, I gave you decades of benefit you never earned. I simply stopped extending it." He let out a humorless laugh. "That's cute. You think cutting me out makes you noble?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her gaze surgical. "I think it makes me free." Martin cleared his throat softly. "Let's stay on track. Mr. Bishop, Mrs. Bishop, we're here to discuss your objections to the will's current terms." Monica leaned forward, her voice smooth and cold. "We're not here to fight, Martin. We just want fairness." Eleanor reached into her leather tote and withdrew a thick binder, setting it gently on the table. The sound was deliberate. Final. "What's that supposed to be?" Connor asked. "Context," Eleanor said. She opened it to the first tab, color-coded, precise, and began sliding sheets toward Martin, then toward Connor and Monica. "Scholarships, support records, proof of every tuition payment, rent assistance, loan forgiveness, and debt I covered for you over the past decade." Connor's smirk faltered as his eyes caught the totals printed at the bottom of the first page. "I also included," Eleanor continued evenly, "a log of phone calls unanswered, visits declined, and birthdays forgotten. Not out of bitterness, merely for completeness." Monica exhaled sharply. "This isn't about the past." "It always is," Eleanor said, "because the past is what defines character. And I can document that too." She flipped to another section. Photographs, printed emails, and a spreadsheet of charitable donations under her son Greg's memorial fund. "While you were investing in social media posts about legacy wealth, I was funding literacy programs and scholarships under Greg's name. Quietly, consistently, without your acknowledgement." Connor shoved the papers back toward her. "You think this justifies stealing my inheritance?" Eleanor's expression softened, but only slightly. "No, Connor. It explains why you never had one to begin with." Martin, who had remained silent, finally interjected, his tone even. "Everything Mrs. Bishop has provided is admissible evidence of fiduciary soundness and intent. There's no case here for coercion or incompetence, only choice." Monica's composure cracked. "Martin, you can't possibly think this is fair." He looked at her, polite, unflinching. "Fair isn't always favorable, Mrs. Bishop." The words hung in the air like the final note of a symphony. Connor leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Martin. "You think this is over," he said quietly, "but you've just made it worse for yourself." Eleanor met his gaze without blinking. "No, darling, I've made it honest." He pushed back from the table so hard the chair screeched against the floor. "You'll regret this when you're alone in that museum you call a house." Eleanor's voice was soft, almost tender. "Alone doesn't scare me. I've been alone in a room full of family for years." Connor hesitated, just long enough for the silence to settle around him like judgment, then turned and stormed out, the glass door slamming behind him with a hollow thud. For a moment, no one spoke. The snow outside drifted past the windows, slow and soundless. Monica rose more carefully, gathering her purse. "You'll hear from us again?" she said, though even she didn't sound convinced. Eleanor nodded once. "I look forward to it." When they were gone, Martin exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You handled that perfectly. I don't think they'll try. But if they do, it'll be a very short fight." Eleanor closed the binder, her hands steady. "They'll try anyway. People like that can't accept an ending they didn't write." Martin smiled faintly. "Then let them read what you've written." Eleanor stood, adjusting her coat. Outside, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain, blurring the city skyline. As she reached the door, she looked back once. "He thinks he can win by shouting," she said. "But sometimes, silence is the loudest weapon." She stepped into the cold, her boots sinking into fresh snow, and behind her, Martin's office light reflected off the glass like a quiet applause. New Year's morning came wrapped in white silence. The snowfall had slowed to a hush, and Eleanor Bishop's house glowed from within. The tall windows fogged with the warmth of laughter and conversation. For the first time in years, it wasn't family who filled the space, but women who had chosen to be there. The long oak dining table gleamed beneath a lace runner, silver platters lined with quiche, scones, and fruit. The air carried the scent of butter and brewed coffee, the kind that turned a winter morning into comfort. Trudy bustled in from the kitchen with a pot of maple syrup. "You've outdone yourself, Elle. Martha Stewart herself couldn't top this." Eleanor smiled, setting down a bowl of sugared cranberries. "Martha has a staff. I have purpose." The women from her book club, teachers, retirees, one young mother with ink still on her fingers from late-night journaling, gathered around the table. Their voices filled the house with the easy music of shared conversation. Books, weather, life. Nothing forced, nothing barbed. When they raised their glasses of cider to toast the new year, Eleanor joined in, her hand steady. "To stories," she said, "and to the women brave enough to write them." They clinked glasses, laughter spilling into the high-ceilinged room. Trudy leaned over, stage whispering, "You know, for a woman accused of being heartless, you throw one hell of a brunch." Eleanor chuckled softly. "It helps to cook for people who taste the food instead of the politics." The doorbell rang just as the last plates were cleared. Trudy went to answer while Eleanor gathered the napkins, humming under her breath. A moment later, Trudy returned holding an envelope. "Mail came early. This one's from your lawyer." Eleanor wiped her hands and took it, sliding a single sheet from inside. She read quickly, then folded it once, her expression serene. "Good news?" Trudy asked. "Just confirmation," Eleanor said. "Martin filed the Living Trust amendments this morning. The foundation will now oversee all residual assets, and the endowment for the literacy program will double after I'm gone." Trudy blinked. "After you're gone? You say that like you've got an appointment scheduled." Eleanor smiled wryly. "Trudy, I'm 76. The appointment's on the books whether I RSVP or not." The room erupted in gentle laughter, but there was no fear in her tone, no shadow of dread. Only acceptance, firm, calm, earned. Later, after the guests had hugged her goodbye and the house had settled into its afternoon quiet, Eleanor sat at her writing desk by the bay window. A thin sunlight cut through the clouds, turning the snow outside into a mirror-bright expanse. On her desk lay the local paper, folded open to the feature that had run that morning. Quiet champion of women's literacy, Eleanor Bishop's legacy of learning. Her photograph, candid, taken at the Foundation's winter fundraiser, showed her mid-laugh, her hands clasped with the program directors. Beneath it, a quote, "Books gave me my voice. This is how I give it back." She traced the printed line with one finger, feeling not pride, but completion. The phone rang once, twice, before she answered. "Mrs. Bishop?" A bright young voice said. "This is Allison from the Literacy Foundation. The paper's piece on you brought in 3 new sponsors. We were hoping you might consider leading our spring memoir writing group." Eleanor glanced out the window, where the neighborhood children were building a crooked snowman near the sidewalk. "I'd be happy to," she said. "Every woman should learn her story matters." After the call, she spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging books in the study, the ones Greg had loved, the ones Connor never opened. Her fingers lingered over each spine like they were old friends. When she was done, she made tea, put on a Billie Holiday record, and let the house fill with sound again. The mail slot clattered. She shuffled to the door, finding a single envelope on the rug. No return address, but the handwriting small and careful. She opened it with her letter opener, eyes narrowing as she read. "Dear Mrs. Bishop, I'm writing to thank you. I received a scholarship in your son's name and used it to finish nursing school. I wanted you to know I passed my boards last week. You changed my life without ever knowing me." The letter went on. Gratitude, humility, hope. All written in looping penmanship that trembled at the edges. Eleanor set it down, her throat tight. The world outside was fading toward dusk, the snow catching the last golden light. Trudy reappeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. "You okay, Elle?" Eleanor nodded, her voice quiet but sure. "Yes. It's strange, Trudy. I think this is the first time in years I felt like everything is exactly where it belongs." She placed the letter beside the folded newspaper article and stood by the window as the sun slipped behind the houses across the street. For a long moment, she simply watched the snow fall, not as a warning of endings, but as a blessing of stillness. Then, almost to herself, she said, "If this is what dying looks like, it's not nearly as frightening as living used to be." By mid-January, the city had begun to thaw. The icicles on the Cathedral Hill porches dripped rhythmically, and the air had that fleeting clarity that came between snowstorms. In her upstairs study, Eleanor Bishop sat at her desk with her old fountain pen poised above the thick cream stationery she reserved for moments that mattered. The house was quiet except for the faint whistle of the radiator and Billie Holiday humming through the speakers. She'd written and rewritten the first line a dozen times before finally committing to it in ink. "I raised a son, not a dynasty." The words bled gently into the page, deliberate, final. For years, Eleanor had been written about. Never by choice. Obituaries for Greg, charity blurbs, polite social columns that treated her as a relic of an older, gentler St. Paul. This time, she would tell the story herself. By the time the kettle whistled, she'd filled 3 pages in her neat librarian's hand about Greg's integrity, about the danger of confusing inheritance with love, about how legacies were built on character, not cash. It wasn't bitter, it was clean. She titled it "What I Owe and What I Don't." When she finished, she sealed the envelope, addressed it to the St. Paul Gazette, and walked it to the mailbox herself, her boots crunching over the salted sidewalk. The air stung her cheeks, but it also felt pure, like a confession that didn't need forgiveness. 3 days later, the op-ed ran on the front page of the Sunday Voices section under her chosen title. The editors had added a subhead, Matriarch Eleanor Bishop on Family, Loss, and the Freedom of Giving Away What's Never Truly Yours. The response was immediate. Letters poured in, not the hateful ones she half expected, but hundreds of messages of admiration and solidarity. Local teachers wrote thanking her for her advocacy. Former students from Greg's old school sent emails about how his scholarship fund had changed lives. The foundation's inbox overflowed. By Thursday, the Gazette's website had her column trending. A talk show producer even called, asking if she'd appear on a segment about empowered aging. She politely declined. "I'm done being performed," she said. That weekend, the foundation hosted a small luncheon in her honor. A celebration of legacy, the invitation read. The hall downtown was draped in winter whites and gold, the tables lined with tulips and candles. When Eleanor arrived, applause broke out, unprompted and genuine. The director, a young woman named Allison, raised a glass. "For Mrs. Bishop," she said, "whose generosity has turned quiet pages into roaring voices." Eleanor accepted the toast with modest grace, a small smile lifting her lips. For the first time in years, she felt the strange weight of pride without guilt. But not everyone was celebrating. That night, in a downtown newsroom across the river, a young reporter named Elise logged into her voicemail and frowned at a string of increasingly desperate messages. "Connor Bishop here," the latest one said, his tone brittle and manic. "You people are printing lies. My grandmother's manipulating the story. You need to hear the real side, the abuse, the betrayal." He'd left 6 messages in 2 days, each angrier than the last. When Elise called him back, her voice was courteous but firm. "Mr. Bishop, we've reviewed the public documents and spoken with the foundation and Mrs. Bishop's attorney. Her actions were transparent and fully legal. There's no story here." Connor's voice cracked. "So you're just going to let her smear me?" "No one's smearing you," Elise said. "She's just telling the truth first." The line went dead. Back on Cathedral Hill, Trudy arrived at Eleanor's doorstep carrying a bottle of champagne in one hand and a grin that could melt ice. "Guess who made the Gazette's most read list?" she crowed. "You, Eleanor Bishop, the quiet revolution in pearls." Eleanor laughed, ushering her in. "You always know how to make humility sound scandalous." They popped the cork in the kitchen, the bubbles spilling over the counter as Trudy poured 2 glasses. "To rewriting the ending," Trudy said. Eleanor lifted her glass. "To writing it myself." The glasses clinked. Outside, the city glowed in soft gold, streetlights haloed by snow, the hum of life carrying through the cold air. For a few minutes, they just stood there, letting the fizz and laughter fill the silence that used to ache. Then, as the laughter faded, Eleanor noticed the blinking red light on her landline. A message waiting. She pressed play, half expecting a foundation thank you or a neighbor's holiday greeting. Instead, Monica's clipped voice filled the room. "This isn't over, Eleanor. I've filed a formal will contest. You'll hear from our attorney soon." The message ended with a mechanical beep. Trudy set her glass down slowly. "Well," she said, "guess the new year's off to a lively start." Eleanor's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened just enough to catch the light. "Let them come," she murmured. "They've mistaken my calm for surrender." Outside, a new snow began to fall. Slow, steady, and relentless. The courthouse in downtown St. Paul was a granite monolith, stoic, unblinking, older than the arguments it contained. On a cold February morning, its steps glittered with frost, the city air thin and sharp. Reporters lingered across the street, cameras low but ready, their curiosity simmering beneath restraint. Inside, the courtroom hummed with the quiet tension of people pretending patience. The seal of the state of Minnesota hung above the judge's bench, framed by pale oak panels. Rows of benches creaked softly as spectators shifted, whispering to one another about the will case that had quietly stirred the city's social circles. Eleanor Bishop entered with measured grace, escorted by Martin Dahl. She wore charcoal gray, dignified, not mournful, and her gloves remained folded neatly in her hands. She didn't glance toward the defense table, where Monica sat stiff-backed and pale beside Connor, whose restless leg bounced under the table like a ticking bomb. The judge entered, a woman in her early 60s with a gaze that could still silence an entire room. "We're here on the matter of Bishop versus Bishop, regarding the contesting of a last will and testament." Monica's attorney, a sleek man in an expensive navy suit, rose first. "Your Honor, this is a tragic case of undue influence," he began smoothly. "My client's mother-in-law, Mrs. Eleanor Bishop, was manipulated, or at the very least, not of sound mind, when she revised her will. The new document represents coercion, mental decline, and—" Martin stood before the man could finish. "Objection to conjecture, Your Honor. Will prove Mrs. Bishop was, and remains, fully competent, intellectually, legally, and morally." The judge nodded once. "Proceed." The lawyer tried to paint Eleanor as a grieving, fragile widow swayed by opportunists at the foundation. He gestured dramatically toward her. A 76-year-old woman, widowed, isolated, surrounded by those who admired her generosity and conveniently benefited from it. Eleanor watched him with the calm detachment of a librarian enduring a late return excuse. She did not flinch. When Martin's turn came, his presentation was the opposite of spectacle. He moved slowly, methodically, placing one exhibit after another on the evidence table. Signed evaluations from 2 cognitive specialists, notarized video footage of Eleanor answering complex recall tests, timestamps from her living trust filings, her public statement in the Gazette about literacy and independence. "Mrs. Bishop's mental clarity is not in question," Martin said, his voice even. "The only thing being questioned here is her right to use it." The judge watched the screen as the courtroom lights dimmed. The video played. There was Eleanor, seated in a doctor's office weeks earlier, responding to the examiner's questions with quiet authority. "Can you describe the concept of compound interest?" "It's the world's simplest trick for turning patience into power," Eleanor replied in the video. Laughter rippled through the courtroom before the judge tapped her gavel lightly. When the lights returned, the silence was heavier, and Monica's attorney looked like a man realizing he'd overplayed his hand. Martin turned to Eleanor. "Would you like to speak, Mrs. Bishop?" She rose, steady, her hands resting lightly on the rail. The courtroom seemed to lean in as she spoke. "I didn't write my will out of bitterness," she said. "I wrote it out of clarity. My husband built a life through work. My son built one through kindness. My grandson built one through expectation." Connor's jaw tensed. He looked down at his lap. "I didn't take anything from them," Eleanor continued. "I simply stopped pretending that family is measured in inheritance. I chose peace over performance. And if that peace costs me their approval, so be it." The judge's pen stilled. When Eleanor sat down, even the reporters in the back didn't move. The sound of the heating vent was the only noise in the room. Monica's attorney made one final, perfunctory attempt at objection, something about undue emotional strain. But the words felt hollow. The judge adjusted her glasses, her voice calm but decisive. "The evidence is clear. Mrs. Bishop acted with full capacity and legal soundness. This case is dismissed, with prejudice." The gavel fell like a full stop at the end of a long, exhausted sentence. Connor slumped back, eyes fixed on the table, his bravado extinguished. Monica stood too quickly, her purse strap catching on the chair. She muttered something under her breath. Eleanor didn't bother to hear what. Martin gathered the folders, unhurried. "Told you they wouldn't stand a chance," he said quietly. Eleanor exhaled, not triumphantly, but with the relief of someone who'd finally stopped holding her breath. "I didn't need to win, Martin," she said softly. "Just to be done." As they stepped into the hall, camera flashes flared briefly from the doors, muffled questions spilling through the marble corridor. Eleanor paused, her coat draped over her arm. Through the courthouse's tall windows, snow fell again, light, endless, unbothered by verdicts. She turned to Martin, a faint smile curving her lips. "Do you hear that?" He frowned slightly. "Hear what?" "The silence," she said. "It's mine again." The courthouse victory barely had time to cool before the noise found its next outlet, not in person, but online. It began with a late-night post. Connor Bishop's social media account, once curated with photos of cocktail bars, leased cars, and aspirational quotes, erupted into a manifesto. "This is what happens when greedy boomers hoard everything. My own grandmother cut me out of my inheritance because I called her out. The system is rigged. Families don't care anymore. They just want to die with control." Within hours, the rant went viral, part pity, part spectacle. A thread of comments trailed beneath, some mocking, others sympathetic. But by morning, screenshots had made their way across every local feed in St. Paul. Eleanor saw it over breakfast. The morning paper lay untouched beside her oatmeal, the article headline about her foundation's latest scholarship drive peeking from the fold. Her phone buzzed with a text from Trudy. "Trudy. Well, he's certainly keeping himself busy. Want me to print the comments? They're brutal." Eleanor typed back only 2 words. "Don't bother." She sipped her tea, unruffled. Then, without a hint of hesitation, she forwarded the post to Martin and her financial advisor with a short note. "In case he tries to liquidate anything under the Bishop accounts, still linked to the trust, please secure." Martin's reply came minutes later. "Already done. You're protected as always." Outside, the snow was melting into slush, the gutters whispering with thaw. Eleanor turned the phone face down and opened her desk drawer. Inside lay the newest draft of her will, its crisp pages ready for another revision. By noon, she was back at Martin's office. The same paneled space where this all began months ago. He raised an eyebrow as she entered. "Round 2 already?" "Not quite," she said, removing her gloves. "Just an adjustment." She handed him a folder. Inside, typed amendments, notes in her neat handwriting, and a new directive highlighted in blue ink. Martin scanned it. "Emergency Housing Fund for Female Students at the Literacy Foundation," he read aloud. "You're expanding the program again." Eleanor nodded. "Not everyone needs an inheritance. Some just need a start." Martin smiled faintly. "You realize you're creating a small empire of generosity." She met his gaze with quiet steel. Empires crumble, foundations endure. They signed the paperwork. No ceremony, no hesitation, just ink on paper. The kind of permanence that outlasted gossip and grudges alike. When she returned home, the afternoon light had softened into gold. The house no longer felt cavernous. It breathed. The walls, once lined with family portraits, now bore framed letters and photographs from scholarship recipients, students of every background, their smiles unguarded and bright. A knock came at the door. Trudy stood there, her diner apron still dusted with flour, holding a small package wrapped in butcher paper. "A delivery from the gang," she said. "They've been passing this around the counter all week." Eleanor took it with a curious smile. "If it's pie again, I'll have to start charging for slices." "Better," Trudy said. "Open it." Inside were 24 handmade bookmarks, each one different. Some cut from old menus, others painted or stitched. Names were written in pen on the backs. Sharon, Deb, Midge, Carla. Eleanor ran her fingers over them, the corners rough from use. "These are lovely," she said softly. "Who are they all?" "Regulars," Trudy said. "Most don't know you, but they read about you in the paper. Said you gave them hope. Wanted you to have something from them in return." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I don't recognize a single name." Trudy smiled, eyes shining. "Exactly." They stood there in the foyer, the light slanting across the old wood floors, quiet except for the faint hum of a record still spinning in the parlor. Eleanor gathered the bookmarks in both hands. "Tell them thank you," she said. "Tell them they reminded me that anonymity can be holy." Trudy grinned. "You always did find poetry where the rest of us find paperwork." After she left, Eleanor walked into the study. She opened the file cabinet labeled Bishop Estate and withdrew the last folder with her family's name on it. She flipped through the documents one final time: deeds, policies, signatures, then methodically removed each page that bore Bishop across the header. By dusk, she'd replaced them all with new copies, her maiden name now printed at the top of every form: Eleanor May Whitaker. The typeface looked clean, untouched by history. She ran her thumb along the embossed letters, a small, satisfied smile curving her lips. Outside, the last of the snow had melted into streams running toward the Mississippi. A new chill was settling in, the kind that hinted spring might eventually find its way through. Eleanor turned off the desk lamp, leaving only the soft glow of evening across her papers. The name she'd reclaimed shimmered faintly in the light. "Goodbye, Bishops," she murmured. "You've taken enough space." She closed the drawer with a quiet click, a sound final enough to echo. The snow had returned, soft and steady, the kind that muted the world into gentleness. From her reading nook by the bay window, Eleanor Bishop, or rather, Eleanor Whitaker now, sat wrapped in a wool shawl, a book open in her lap, and a steaming mug beside her. The faint scent of apple and cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. Outside, Cathedral Hill looked dreamlike, the gas lamps glowing through curtains of white. She could see the neighbors' children dragging sleds through the drifts, their laughter faint, distant. For the first time in years, she didn't wish for anyone to fill the silence. The quiet belonged to her now, not as absence, but as reward. The clock ticked softly in the corner. She didn't bother to mark her page when she closed the book. She'd long ago realized that some stories were better felt than finished. When she rose, it was to check the pie cooling on the counter. Golden crust, sugared edges, the smell of butter and clove spilling through the air. It was the first she'd baked since Greg's passing, but this one wasn't meant for a gathering or a gift. This one was hers alone. She sliced it cleanly, placed a single piece on her grandmother's porcelain plate, and carried it back to the window seat. The first bite was almost startling in its comfort. Sweet, tart, perfect. She smiled, not for anyone, not for performance, just for the small truth that it felt good to savor something made only for herself. When the pie cooled, she wrapped the rest in foil, labeled it with a small note. "For breakfast, if you're lucky enough to wake up again." She placed it neatly in the fridge, as though she were caring for someone she'd finally learned to love. Later that afternoon, bundled in her thick coat and knitted gloves, Eleanor walked her block. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and her breath puffed into small clouds. The neighborhood glistened, porches framed in icicles, trees bowed with frost, the world suspended between silence and renewal. Halfway down the street, she stopped to adjust her scarf and looked up. The old Methodist church bell rang in the distance, marking 4 o'clock. It sounded like memory and mercy at once. She thought of Connor, not with anger, but with the cool detachment that came after too many storms. For the first time, she didn't wish to fix him or forgive him. He had chosen his path, and she had chosen hers. When she reached the post office, she slipped a small envelope into the outgoing mail slot. No return address, no signature. Inside was a $200 gift card and a brief note written in her neat cursive. For fresh starts and quiet places. You deserve both. It was addressed to a woman named Melissa Harding, Connor's ex-girlfriend, the one he'd left abruptly 2 years prior. Eleanor had remembered her kindness at Greg's memorial, how the young woman had brought coffee for everyone and spoken to Eleanor as if she were family. This, Eleanor thought as she dropped the envelope, was not forgiveness. It was release. The walk back home was slower, each step deliberate. The world felt lighter, as though she were no longer walking through snow but through air that had been cleared of ghosts. Trudy called just as Eleanor hung up her coat. "I'm coming over," she declared, without greeting. "You don't need to," Eleanor said, smiling. "Too late," Trudy replied. "I've got cocoa and something resembling wisdom. Be ready." 20 minutes later, Trudy was in her kitchen, hair dusted with snow, eyes bright. She took one look at the pie cooling on the counter and laughed. "You baked for one?" Scandalous. Eleanor poured cocoa into 2 mugs anyway. Not everything needs an audience. Trudy took a sip, leaned against the counter, and studied her friend. "You know, Elle, you're different these days. Quieter, sure. But not in the lonely way." Eleanor smiled softly. "That's because it's not loneliness anymore. It's space." Trudy tilted her head. "Regret anything?" Eleanor looked out the window, where snowflakes swirled in the glow of the street lamp. Her voice was calm, unhurried. "Just that I waited so long." They stood together in the silence that followed, not filling it, not fearing it. The house, once a stage for resentment, now held nothing but warmth and the soft hum of peace. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the window panes like a gentle hand. Eleanor took another sip of cocoa, the sweetness grounding her in the moment. When Trudy finally left, Eleanor walked her to the door. The snow had stopped. The night was still. She turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the fireplace flickering across the room. The quiet wrapped around her again, not as a void, but as something sacred. "Not alone," she murmured to herself, setting her empty cup on the mantel. "Just finally with myself." The day she planned her own funeral, the sun was bright enough to feel wrong. March light streamed through Martin's office window, glinting off the polished brass nameplate on his desk. Martin E. Dahl, Esquire. Outside, the sidewalks were lined with slush and puddles, the last remnants of winter melting into the gutters. Eleanor sat across from him, her posture as straight as ever, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. "I'd like it to be simple," she said. "No service, no clergy, just a note in the paper after it's done." Martin looked up from his notes. "You're certain about no family notification?" "Quite certain," she replied. "They'll find out the same way everyone else does. Too late to make it about themselves." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll have the arrangements handled through Summit Memorial. Non-religious, modest, prepaid. And your donations?" "They'll go to the foundation first," she said, "then to the Literacy Endowment and the Housing Fund. I've listed specific instructions in the file." Martin studied her quietly for a moment. "You've thought of everything." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's a librarian's curse. We file things properly, even goodbyes." They went over the final logistics: accounts, notarizations, automatic distributions, the mechanical details of legacy. When it was done, she signed her name for the last time on anything binding. The ink dried quickly, the finality satisfying. "Martin," she said softly as she slid the papers back across his desk, Don't let anyone eulogize me. They'd only tell the version that flatters them. He smiled, a little sadly. You've become a very hard woman to argue with. She reached for her coat. That's because I stopped needing anyone to agree. 2 days later, a small wooden box arrived on her doorstep, the postmark from a storage company she didn't recognize. The handwriting on the label was official, impersonal. Inside the box was a note. Mrs. Bishop. These were located during the final settlement of your son's estate. No record of delivery was found. Our apologies for the delay. Her heart gave one uneven beat. Greg's name was etched faintly on the box lid. Gregory A. Bishop, 1965 to 2022. Eleanor carried it to the parlor, setting it gently on the table beside her chair. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside were 3 journals, leather-bound, worn at the edges, a faint scent of cedar and dust clinging to them. For a long moment she didn't move. The air felt too heavy to breathe. Then, with a small exhale, she opened the first one. Greg's handwriting filled the pages, loops and sharp lines, sentences that ran off margins as though he'd had too much to say for the space he was given. The first entry was dated 12 years before his death. Mom worries too much. I told her not everything she built has to survive her, but she doesn't hear that as reassurance. She hears it as loss. She smiled through the ache. His voice was there, alive and familiar, steadying her in a way she hadn't realized she still needed. As the afternoon dimmed, she read through the years, his notes on teaching, on fatherhood, on frustration with Connor's entitlement, and threaded through it all, small mentions of her, admiration, understanding, love. She pretends she doesn't see what Monica's doing, the quiet digs, the control. But she sees it all. She just chooses grace over confrontation. Maybe too often. If anything happens to me, I trust her to make the hard calls. She's the only one who ever could. Eleanor wiped at her eyes, though the tears came slow, not painful, more like thawing after a long freeze. By nightfall, the house was lit only by the lamp beside her chair. The third journal was thinner, newer. She hesitated before opening it. Inside, tucked between 2 pages, was a folded document. Her breath caught. It was a notarized sheet, yellowed slightly at the edges, an addendum to Greg's will. Her son's signature ran neatly at the bottom. Above it, a paragraph written in his own hand. If circumstances require it, I grant my mother, Eleanor Bishop, full authority to reinterpret and redirect the family estate in whatever way she deems morally and personally sound. She has earned that right through the life she's lived and the love she's given. Below, a date. Nearly 5 years before his death. Eleanor sat perfectly still. For a long time, the only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock and the hum of the furnace. Then she began to laugh, softly at first, then with a kind of astonished relief that broke into tears again. "Oh, Greg," she whispered, "you wouldn't have stood for this. Not for a second." Her voice trembled with something between pride and heartbreak. She traced his signature with one fingertip, as if touching him through time. When she finally closed the journal, the house around her seemed different, lighter, almost reverent. She gathered the papers, placed them carefully back into the box, and tied it shut with a piece of twine. She set it beside her chair, close enough to touch. Outside, snow had begun again. Slow, deliberate flakes drifting down through the streetlight glow. Eleanor leaned back, watching it fall, her son's words echoing in her mind. She had fought to justify her decisions, to defend her choices. But now, she didn't need to. The proof had been here all along, waiting patiently to be found. She smiled through tears that no longer stung. "You left me permission," she whispered, "and I finally used it." The grandfather clock chimed softly, the sound rolling through the quiet house. She closed her eyes for a moment, the faintest smile still on her lips. The snow kept falling, steady, cleansing, endless. By the next morning, the box sat waiting on the corner of her desk, tied neatly in twine. Eleanor Bishop, no, Whitaker, had woken with a purpose as clean and sharp as the March air outside. She didn't eat breakfast, didn't bother with her usual slow tea. She simply put on her wool coat, tucked Greg's codicil into a leather folio, and stepped out into the light. Downtown St. Paul shimmered under thin sunlight, the kind that never quite gave warmth. Cars hissed past on wet pavement, and the cathedral bells struck 9 as she entered Martin Dahl's office building for what she knew would be the last time. His secretary barely had time to announce her before Eleanor stepped through the glass door. Martin looked up from his desk, reading glasses halfway down his nose. "Eleanor, I didn't expect you until this afternoon." "I found something," she said, her tone brisk but not rushed. She held up the folio as though it weighed far more than paper. He rose immediately. "Something important?" "Greg's handwriting," she said quietly, "and his signature." That was all he needed to hear. Martin cleared his desk in a single sweep, making room as she sat. Eleanor untied the twine and opened the folder, laying the document flat. The edges were yellowed, the ink faint, but unmistakably her son's. Martin adjusted his glasses, reading the paragraph twice, slowly. Then he looked up at her, eyes steady. "Well, I'll be damned." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You believe it's valid?" "I'd stake my license on it." He tapped the corner of the page. "The date predates the final will, which means it's binding as an amendment. He explicitly grants you interpretive authority over the estate's disposition. That's ironclad." Eleanor's shoulders eased for the first time in months. "So every choice I made stands." "Every one," Martin confirmed. "Connor and Monica could have contested 1,000 times. It wouldn't have mattered. This codicil silences them for good." Eleanor exhaled, the sound thin but deep. "Then file it," she said. "Attach it to the record permanently. Let it live where they can never reach it." Martin nodded. "I'll have the clerk certify it today." She sat back, eyes lingering on the document. "He always understood," she murmured, "even when he didn't say it out loud." Martin's voice softened. Greg was his father's son in decency, and his mother's in foresight. That earned a small laugh from her, unexpected, almost shy. "You give me too much credit." "Never once," he said, smiling. She rose, pulling her gloves from her coat pocket. "Thank you, Martin, for all of it." He stood as well, his hand briefly resting over hers as she reached for the folder. "You're one of the few clients I'll miss arguing with," he said. Eleanor tilted her head, amused. "Don't worry. I left enough instructions to haunt you for a decade." Outside, the snow had melted into rain, the city's edges blurred in reflection. Eleanor didn't take her usual route home. Instead, she turned toward the river, her umbrella slicing through the drizzle, the Mississippi below, swollen and dark. She passed the old cathedral, the cafe where she'd once met Monica for peace talks, the corner where Greg had taken his first driving lesson. Each landmark passed like a page she'd already read too many times. When she reached the small brick building near Kellogg Boulevard, a community kitchen run by local volunteers, she paused. Inside, the air smelled of lentil soup and warm bread. A woman in an apron greeted her with a bright smile. "Can I help you?" Eleanor nodded, setting a heavy velvet pouch on the counter. "I believe this can help more than I can." The woman untied it, eyes widening as polished silver gleamed in the light. Flatware engraved with the bishop crest. "This must be old family things," Eleanor interrupted gently. "They've been idle long enough. I think they've earned a second life." The woman looked stunned. Are you sure? Eleanor's smile was serene. Quite. Nothing meant for serving should sit behind glass. The woman reached over and squeezed her hand. We'll use them every day. I hope you do, Eleanor said softly and meant it. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped. The clouds split, letting a narrow band of sun stretch across the city. Eleanor walked home slowly, feeling the weight in her chest ease with every block. Trudy was waiting on her porch, arms crossed, scarf crooked, eyes glinting. You disappeared on me again, she scolded. I was returning what never belonged to me, Eleanor said, unlocking the door. Trudy followed her inside, closing the cold out behind them. That sounds cryptic, even for you. Eleanor hung her coat, turning toward her friend. It's done now, fully. Trudy studied her, then pulled her into a sudden, fierce hug. You did it, Elle. You really did. Eleanor chuckled against her shoulder. You sound surprised. I'm proud, Trudy corrected, her voice catching. You fought for peace and got it. Most people never manage both. Eleanor pulled back, her eyes warm. I had good company along the way. Trudy smiled, brushing a tear away with the back of her hand. What now? Eleanor looked past her to the window, where the light was fading to gold. Now I stop fighting, she said, and just live what's left. The clock in the parlor ticked softly. For once, Eleanor didn't rush it. Outside, the last of the rain glimmered on the pavement. Catching the glow of the setting sun, silver turned to light, just as it should be. Snow fell again, soft and ceremonial, the way it always did in December. Eleanor Whitaker's Victorian home glowed like a lantern on Cathedral Hill, its bay windows lit with golden warmth. Inside, laughter rippled through rooms that had once carried only silence. The scent of mulled cider and spiced cookies wove through the air. A jazz record crackled softly from the old turntable. The clink of teacups, the murmur of friendly voices, the quiet rhythm of a winter afternoon. All of it filled the space that had, at last, learned to hold joy again. It was Eleanor's final Christmas tea. Not final in any morbid sense, just final in the way that endings sometimes felt like completions rather than closures. She had written the invitations herself. Careful cursive on cream paper, neighbors, friends, no gifts, just warmth. Trudy stood by the punch bowl, cheeks flushed, chatting with two women from the local library board. Can you believe she made these scones herself? She said, gesturing toward the platter. 77 and still out baking everyone in Ramsey County. Eleanor overheard and smiled, shaking her head as she refilled teacups. Exaggeration, Trudy. Half these came from your diner's oven. Trudy raised her glass of cider. Borrowed labor is still leadership. They laughed. Across the room, one of the younger guests, a college student with ink-stained hands, unfolded a small sheet of paper. Her name was Nina, one of the first recipients of the Women's Literacy Scholarship Eleanor had endowed. Mrs. Whitaker? She said shyly. Would it be all right if I read something? The room quieted. Eleanor nodded, gesturing toward the center rug. Go on, dear. Nina took a steadying breath. It's something I wrote for my creative writing class, inspired by your essay in the Gazette, the one about inheritance and freedom. She began to read, voice trembling but clear. Some women build their legacies in quiet rooms. They rearrange the shelves of the world, filing wrongs into lessons, grief into grace, and names, even their own, into meaning. They teach us that ink can outlast blood, that silence, when chosen, can roar louder than cruelty. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a beat, then filled with applause. Trudy dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Eleanor only smiled, small and proud, her chest swelling with something beyond words. Beautiful, she said softly. Keep writing, Nina. The world needs voices that don't apologize. The young woman flushed pink. Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker, for everything. As the afternoon waned, Eleanor slipped away from the crowd, retreating to her reading nook by the bay window. Outside, the city shimmered beneath snow and twilight. Inside, her house. Her house, not anyone else's, buzzed with the kind of laughter that didn't echo with guilt. On the mantel above the fire sat a line of holiday cards. One stood out, its envelope heavy cream with neat, looping script. She picked it up, smiling before even opening it. From Martin Dahl. Inside, a short note in his dry, lawyerly handwriting. The cleanest will I've ever seen. Merry Christmas, Eleanor. You've made order look like art. She chuckled, placing it back among the others. You'd better hope your next client isn't as thorough, she murmured. The fire crackled, the logs settling into a steady glow. From the parlor, the sound of Trudy's laughter floated through, that bright, contagious cackle that had carried Eleanor through more storms than she could count. A moment later, Trudy appeared in the doorway, carrying a small package wrapped in red velvet ribbon. Don't glare at me, Elle, she said. I know you said no gifts, but this one's sentimental, not material. Eleanor arched an eyebrow, amused. You've said that before, right before handing me something ridiculous. This one's perfect, Trudy insisted. She placed it in Eleanor's lap. The velvet fabric beneath the ribbon felt soft, familiar. Eleanor undid the knot carefully, unfolding the wrapping to reveal a square red pillow, rich velvet, embroidered with neat gold thread. Across the front the words read, "No more spills." For a second the room blurred in her vision. Then Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, low and full, shaking her shoulders. Trudy Lawson, you sentimental fool. Trudy grinned. Consider it closure. You turned one stain into a revolution. Eleanor traced the letters with her fingertips. The embroidery was firm and even, each stitch precise, deliberate like her. You do realize, she said softly, that I've come to cherish that spill more than any toast or celebration we ever had. Trudy winked. Then my work here is done. They sat together in companionable silence, the fire reflecting in the polished brass of the fireplace screen. The guests' voices drifted from the kitchen, warm, distant, content. Eleanor leaned back, the pillow nestled at her side, the steam from her mug curling upward like ribbon. The snow outside had thickened again, falling heavy and slow, each flake catching the light from her windows before disappearing into the night. Her gaze lingered on the flames, on the life she had remade from the ashes of expectation. She whispered, mostly to herself, the words she'd waited a lifetime to say aloud. A quiet benediction, a final truth. He stained my dress, she said, her voice steady, almost fond. I rewrote his future. The fire popped, sparks rising briefly before fading into the chimney's dark, and in the soft warmth of her chosen family's laughter, Eleanor Whitaker smiled, utterly, finally at peace.